It was a late afternoon in Chicago, Illinois, sunlight cutting through the tall buildings and falling on my kitchen table. The phone rang, and I picked it up, expecting routine news about bills or neighbors. Instead, the words on the line stopped my heart. My son's heart had failed. I dropped the receiver, hands trembling, unable to breathe. Everything I thought I knew about life, family, and trust changed in that moment. I stood frozen, staring out at the skyline, knowing some truths would take years to reveal. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, and stay till the end. The hospital phone rang, and it felt like the sound came from far away, distorted and strange, like it belonged to someone else's life. I froze, my hands hovering over the receiver, heart hammering so loudly I feared it would burst. When I finally answered, the words shattered everything I knew. My son's heart had stopped. I could barely process it. I felt my knees weaken, my stomach twist, my vision blur. I dropped everything I was holding and ran out of the house. The world outside was cold, indifferent, cars moving past, pedestrians going about their ordinary lives while mine had just been ripped apart. I didn't care about traffic lights, about honking cars, or the people who glanced at me with brief curiosity. All I could think about was reaching him in time, to hold him, to tell him that I was there, that I loved him, that I would protect him. Every step I took felt heavy and fast at the same time, like running through water while being pulled in 1,000 directions. By the time I reached the hospital, I felt disoriented, the smell of antiseptic filling my nostrils and making me gag slightly. The sliding doors opened with a hiss, and the fluorescent lights burned my eyes. But I barely noticed. I asked for him immediately, voice cracking, and a nurse glanced at me with polite detachment, asking for my son's name. My hands shook so violently I could barely write it down. They led me to the room, and I stopped dead in my tracks. The bed was empty, the monitors silent. I could hear nothing but the hollow echo of my own heartbeat. My son was lying there, alone, frail and fading, and the woman who had promised to love and care for him wasn't by his side. She was gone. How could she not be here? What could be more important than the life of the boy she had married, the father of her children, the man whose heart had stopped? My eyes burned with tears I refused to let fall, not because I didn't feel them, but because my mind was too busy registering the betrayal. I noticed the chair beside the bed, perfectly arranged as if it had been waiting for someone to sit in it. The glass of water untouched, the folded blanket. Everything screamed her absence. I fell to my knees beside my son's bed, fingers trembling as they brushed against his cold hand. I imagined it still warm, still his hand, still the same little boy who had clung to my skirts during thunderstorms, who had whispered in my lap that he would never leave me. The memories struck me like a tidal wave, crashing over me while the reality of the moment threatened to pull me under. The monitors weren't just machines. They were the boundary between life and death. And I had arrived to find him suspended on the edge. I held his hand tightly, willing him to feel my presence, to know that someone was there, someone who would not abandon him. But she had left. She had chosen herself over the man whose life was slipping away. I could not comprehend it fully. The audacity, the coldness, the absence of what I expected to be instinctive human care. Hours passed in what felt like a suspended nightmare. Nurses came in and out, checking vitals that no longer responded, their faces a mixture of professional detachment and sympathetic regret. I barely noticed them. All I could see was the empty corner where she should have been. Her absence was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making every breath shallow and every heartbeat painful. The reality was brutal. My son's life, the last moments he might have had, were witnessed by me alone. I whispered to him, words barely audible, promises I could not yet keep but would see through. I told him to rest, to be at peace, knowing I would take care of everything, knowing I would see that justice was done for him. I felt the anger rise, slow and steady, like molten lava filling a cavity carved by betrayal. The hurt was deep, sharp, precise. I could not allow this to be unseen or unanswered. Her absence that day revealed everything I hadn't wanted to see. I realized how long she had spent pretending, smiling, performing for appearances, while the person who truly mattered, my son, was fighting his last battle alone. I thought of the nights she stayed out, the parties she attended, the laughter that echoed while he lay in pain. The realization made my blood boil, but it also gave me focus. I would not act in blind rage. I would plan. I would wait. Every detail, every photograph, every whisper, every trace of her negligence would be documented. She had shown her true face, and now the world would see it too, if I did my part. I stayed by his side until the very last breath, feeling the life leave his body and his hand loosen in mine. The room felt colder than ever, and yet a strange clarity settled over me. The betrayal I had witnessed had awakened something inside me, the resolve to ensure that the woman who smiled while he died would never smile in comfort again. I would use what she had revealed herself, her disregard for life, her vanity, her selfishness, to expose her fully. She had underestimated me, underestimated the power of a mother's resolve. I rose from my knees, tears streaked on my face, the weight of grief heavy but focused. I whispered a promise into the empty room. I would make her see that no one gets away with such betrayal. My son's death would not be in vain. The next morning, she arrived at the hospital, sunglasses hiding her eyes, a mask of fake sorrow plastered across her face. She approached me, pretending to weep quietly, leaning in as if I could not see through her act. The smell of her perfume filled the air, overpowering and sharp, and it carried with it the faint scent of the party from the night before. She hugged me, whispered, "I'm so sorry," and yet every movement betrayed her. Her steps were light, almost dancing, her hands adjusting her hair as if preparing for a photograph rather than grieving the loss of my son. I could see it all, the calculated grace, the rehearsed sorrow, the shallow performance she thought would hide the truth. Behind her, my son's friends and caregivers stood silently, their eyes darting from me to her, acknowledging what I already knew. They had seen the post, had seen her smiling, carefree, as though life had granted her some unearned triumph while my son struggled in the hospital bed hours before. Their silence was confirmation, a shared understanding that the woman before me was performing for appearances, not out of genuine love or loss. I could feel their unspoken judgment like a weight pressing down on the room, and I drew strength from it. I didn't need to speak. The truth was written on her face and mirrored in their glances. Every detail of that morning reinforced the betrayal. The way she dabbed at imaginary tears, the careful positioning of her hands, the shallow rhythm of her breaths, it all screamed of rehearsed innocence. I remembered the photograph from the night before, the wine in her hand, the gleam of pleasure on her lips, and now I realized how deliberately she had cultivated that image. It was more than disrespect. It was a statement, a declaration of her own priorities over the life of my son, over the grief that should have bound us together. She had chosen herself, her comfort, her appearance, over my child's suffering. I could feel my own anger rising, but I kept it under control. Years of discipline, patience, and strategy had taught me to observe before acting, to measure before responding. My hands did not shake. My voice did not waver. I let her speak, let her attempt her apologies, and I watched the subtle gestures, the fleeting glances, the nervous adjustments she made as she realized that her performance might not convince everyone here. Each small action confirmed what I already suspected. She was incapable of genuine remorse, and her care for my son had never existed. As I watched her move through the room, I thought of every moment my son had trusted her, every sacrifice he had made to include her in his life, every time he defended her to friends, family, and even me. I remembered the nights she refused to sit beside him during illness, the days she spent away while he needed support, the letters he had written but never sent detailing her deceit and selfishness. All those moments, once private and hidden, now became pieces of a puzzle that exposed her true character. And here she was, wearing her rehearsed sorrow like a mask, pretending to the world that she had been there, that she had cared. I could not look at her directly at first. I had to turn my gaze slightly away, to control my emotions, to prevent the anger and grief from boiling over. Her presence was toxic. A mixture of the past and the betrayal she represented, the mocking photograph still vivid in my mind. Yet, I observed every movement, every attempt at subtle manipulation, noting the lies in her posture, the false warmth in her voice, and the emptiness behind her eyes. She was a master of illusion, but not a master of perception. I could see through her carefully constructed facade, and in that, I found clarity. The nurses and friends who were present could feel the tension, the electric weight of truth hanging in the air. They had seen the post, knew the photograph, and understood the hypocrisy. I felt their support, subtle but powerful, flowing into me. I did not need to speak to make a statement. My calm presence, the careful observation, and the weight of silent accusation said more than any words could. She could not perform for everyone. Her audience was there, and the truth was unmasking her in real time. I thought of the years spent protecting him, the nights I had stayed awake while he slept lightly, the sacrifices I had made to ensure he could have a life filled with love and security. And now, she was attempting to rewrite the narrative, to paint herself as a grieving wife, while the reality of her choices had inflicted pain upon the person I loved most. That realization gave me resolve. I would not allow her to escape accountability. I would ensure that her smiling, careless exterior would be confronted with the evidence of her actions. As she lingered, fidgeting, I finally raised my gaze to meet hers. She tried to avoid it, looking anywhere but at the eyes that had seen everything. And in that instant, I understood. Her carefully rehearsed mask was failing. The tension in her shoulders, the unevenness of her voice, the trembling of her hands, all of it betrayed her. She could no longer hide behind appearances. The camera, the photograph, and my own vigilance were exposing her for what she truly was, someone incapable of empathy, someone who prioritized self-interest over the life of my son. The room was heavy with silence. Her words fell flat, her gestures meaningless, and her performance cracked under the scrutiny of those who had witnessed the truth. And I, standing calm and composed, held the evidence of betrayal not just in my hands, but in my presence. I realized then that her attempts to project grief and innocence were futile. The facade she relied upon for so long could not withstand the weight of reality. And in that moment, I felt the first stirrings of justice, a quiet but undeniable victory that would soon reach its full form. While clearing my son's apartment the day after the funeral, I came across a stack of letters tucked away in the bottom drawer of his desk. They weren't letters he had sent. They were letters he had written to himself, journals of pain, frustration, and a quiet desire for justice that he never wanted to burden anyone with. Each page carried his careful handwriting, the kind that reflected patience and thoughtfulness, but also sorrow that ran deep and unspoken. He had documented her actions, the way she had treated him during his illness, the subtle manipulations, the financial decisions that drained him, and the emotional neglect that had left him feeling isolated and unseen. I read them one by one, my hands trembling not from the effort, but from the understanding of the depth of betrayal he had endured, and how silently he had carried it all, even from me. The first letters were simple notes, reminders of the times she had refused to stay by his side when he needed care. She would make excuses, a headache, a phone call, a social engagement, and he would hide his disappointment behind forced smiles. He wrote about the nights he woke up coughing, the anxiety that gripped him when the pain escalated, and how he would quietly call her name, only to be met with the sound of her door closing somewhere else in the house. In those pages, I could feel the isolation he had endured, the loneliness that came from expecting support and finding only absence. The letters painted a vivid picture of a woman who cared more for appearances than for the person she had vowed to love, and every detail stung as I read through them, knowing he had trusted her completely until the very end. As I continued, the letters grew more specific, more damning. He wrote about the bills she had manipulated, the charges that were mysteriously higher than expected, the trips she took while he was resting, and the extravagant purchases that drained their savings. Each line was a silent accusation, a record of the times he had silently tolerated her actions, hoping they would pass, hoping that love would compel her to change. The frustration in his words was tempered by kindness. He never wanted to accuse her outright while he lived, but he wanted someone to know the truth after he was gone. I felt a mixture of anger and sorrow as I read these notes. Anger for what she had done, and sorrow for the quiet suffering he had endured, hidden from the world. Among the letters, I discovered references to threats she had made, not loud or obvious, but subtle and insidious. Notes described the moments she had said things that undermined his confidence, that made him question his own decisions, and that attempted to control even the smallest aspects of his life. She had isolated him from friends and family, ensuring that he had no support when he became ill. The more I read, the more I realized that her smiling photograph beside his coffin was not only false, but a cruel testament to how carefully she had curated the world to benefit herself, leaving him vulnerable, alone, and betrayed. One letter detailed how she had tried to manipulate his will in her favor, the careful planning he had discovered but never confronted openly. He had written down every step she had taken, the conversations she had with lawyers, the lies she had spun to maintain control of finances, and the ways she had tried to distance him from anyone who could intervene. The weight of it all was overwhelming, yet in each word I could hear his sense of moral clarity. He did not want revenge, he only wanted fairness, but he knew that fairness had to be preserved, even if he could not enforce it himself. Reading these letters, I understood the full scope of her betrayal, and I vowed silently that I would not allow her to succeed in erasing his wishes, his love, or his legacy. The letters also included his observations of her behavior in public, the small smiles, the attention she gave to friends, the way she tried to show concern to outsiders while remaining indifferent in private. He wrote about the deception, how she would laugh at jokes, nod in agreement, and pretend to care while doing nothing to alleviate his suffering. Each line was a lesson in observation, a testament to his intelligence, patience, and kindness. He had documented her not to humiliate her, but to ensure that if anything happened to him, someone would know the truth. That someone, I realized with a heavy heart, was me. I spent hours with the letters, reading and rereading them, piecing together the story my son had lived but never voiced aloud. I felt his fear, his exhaustion, and his quiet hope that the people around him, his family, his friends, his mother, would understand the reality when the time came. And now, the time had come. I held each letter close, feeling the weight of responsibility. I understood that she had not only betrayed him, but she had attempted to erase him from his own life, to replace truth with illusion, to turn love into a transaction, and joy into a performance. Finally, as I placed the letters back in the drawer, I made a decision. I would act not out of anger, but out of justice. Every secret he had recorded, every note, every observation, every proof of her betrayal, it would all become the foundation for exposing the truth. I would ensure that the woman who smiled for the camera while my son suffered would face the consequences of her actions. Her photograph, her lies, and her performance would no longer shield her. The truth he had documented in silence would now speak loudly, and I would be the one to deliver it. I felt his presence in the room with me, guiding me, giving me strength to act with clarity and calm, and I knew that in fulfilling this, I was honoring him, preserving his memory, and finally protecting him even after he was gone. After going through the letters, I noticed the small digital camera my son had kept on a shelf in the corner of the living room. It was old, a little scratched, but clearly important to him. The memory card inside caught my attention. half-used, untouched for months, and filled with recordings that my son had made quietly, documenting the reality of his life while no one else noticed. I felt a chill as I slid it into my laptop, unsure of what I might find. My hands shook, but I knew that this tape could reveal the truth he had never been able to tell me fully. The first few videos were mundane, everyday moments. He recorded himself moving around his apartment, checking his mail, sometimes adjusting the camera to capture the room. But soon, the videos changed. He spoke directly into the lens, quietly, without any fear of being overheard. His voice was calm, measured, but underneath it was a quiet urgency. He described her actions, her manipulations, and the growing sense of danger he felt in his own home. He documented how she took his money, how she rearranged accounts, and how she spent nights away, leaving him sick and alone. Each recording made my stomach tighten, the weight of her betrayal becoming heavier with every frame. One video was particularly jarring. He had set the camera near the living room, facing the corner where she often sat late at night. I watched as she entered, speaking softly on the phone. Her tone was sweet, almost maternal, but the content was far from it. He narrated it in real time, noting how she discussed money transfers, late-night calls with unknown men, and plans that excluded him entirely. He even recorded the moment she counted cash from his account while he slept in the bedroom, drugged by his exhaustion, too weak to intervene. Watching it unfold, I realized the extent of her deception. She had been carefully hiding her intentions while pretending to care, and he had known it all along. Another clip showed her making threats. Not loud, not angry, but subtle, whispered under the cover of darkness. He captured the way she tried to frighten him, manipulating his fear, ensuring that he remained compliant. My heart ached as I watched him record every detail without confronting her directly, his eyes tired, but his resolve unwavering. He had taken every precaution, understanding that she was dangerous and that he had to survive until the right time came. I felt both pride and sorrow, pride in his foresight, sorrow for the pain he endured silently. The tape also revealed her interactions with others. She would speak to friends, acquaintances, and even her own family, painting a different picture of our son. The one she presented to the world was of a man overly dramatic, demanding, and impossible to please. Yet in his recordings, I saw the truth. He was gentle, patient, and enduring, documenting her lies without adding exaggeration. Each clip I watched was a record of the quiet injustice he suffered, and it broke something inside me to see him so careful, so meticulous, and yet powerless against her schemes. I discovered another tape where he spoke about her late-night activities, the dinners she attended, the trips she planned, all while he was too weak or too ill to leave his apartment. He described her behavior in detail, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the excitement in her voice, all contrasted against his own struggle with sickness and fatigue. His words were precise, his observations unflinching. He had captured her life in stark contrast to his own suffering, creating a meticulous record for someone to see, someone who would understand the truth and act. The final video made my blood run cold. He ended with a direct message to me. "Dad, if anything happens to me, if I am gone, you must know the truth. Don't let her take what is mine. Don't let her erase my life or my legacy. Keep this safe. Expose her. Make her accountable." His voice cracked slightly near the end, and I felt tears stream down my face. He had trusted me to finish what he could not, to act where he had been powerless. I held the camera tightly, the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. Every frame, every word, every subtle detail. It was all evidence of her betrayal, meticulously captured by the son she thought she could manipulate. For the first time, I understood the full scale of her deceit. She had managed to smile, to charm, to deceive, and to take advantage of him, but she had underestimated his foresight and his love for justice. He had made sure that everything was documented for someone to hold her accountable, and that someone was me. The sense of betrayal I had felt initially now turned into a determined resolve. I would not falter. I would use every video, every recording, every silent testament of his suffering to ensure that she could no longer hide behind her lies and smiles. As I closed the laptop, I felt a mix of grief, anger, and purpose. My son had suffered, yes, but he had also prepared the path for truth. I was the final piece of that path. I promised him, silently, that I would act with clarity and precision, that I would see justice done, not for revenge alone, but to honor his life, his struggles, and his meticulous care in documenting the truth. Every memory card, every clip, every whisper captured on those videos was a testament to his intelligence, patience, and enduring hope that someone would finally see. I now carried that mission forward, determined to ensure that she would face the consequences of her actions and that the world would finally understand the reality he had lived. They said the funeral would be small. I did not want a crowd. I wanted quiet and truth. I wanted my son to be remembered for who he was, not for the lies she had wrapped around him. The day arrived with a dull, cold sky. Friends came, a few neighbors, his old co-workers. They spoke softly. They carried flowers in careful hands. I stood by the casket and watched each face as they passed. My granddaughter clung to my skirt and did not understand the weight of the room. She only knew that her father was gone and that people were kind in that odd, careful way adults have at funerals. She insisted on hiring a photographer. She said the photos would be for the family. I watched while she picked the picture packages and signed the check. I watched while she arranged a photo near the casket, turning the camera as if she wanted the perfect angle for the light. People thought she was grieving. They thought she had lost everything. I watched her fix her hair between shots, dab at her face like someone practicing sadness. And when she smiled for a posed image, the world did not yet know what I knew. The photograph that would later become proof of her false face was taken that day with bright, professional light and a careful hand. After the service, I stayed back longer than most. I wanted a quiet moment with my son. I wanted to set things right in my own small way. I walked slowly around the room where people had put cards on a table and photos on easels. I touched the frames that held our family. I breathed in the smells of lilies and old polish. I thought of the camera files I had found. I thought of the notes he had written. I thought of his voice in the videos telling me to protect what was his. The evidence was ready. My grief had a ledger now. His truth had a paper trail and a card with recordings. I folded my hands and held the truth like a shield. When I left the funeral hall, people were still saying their goodbyes. She stood by the doorway, surrounded by quiet friends who murmured to her. She looked at me once and then looked away. I had the evidence in my bag. I had the memory card, the letters, the receipts. I had the photos from her parties. I had the post she made while my son lay alone. I felt the weight of all those things together, heavy but clear. I did not need to shout. I only needed to act. 2 days later, the photograph she had posed for was used in the funeral program and later posted by a neighbor online as a memory of the day. It circulated quickly. People who had been at the service shared it, and then others I did not know liked and commented. In the image, she looked composed, the kind of composed some teach themselves in a mirror. She was near the casket, hand on the cover, eyes soft, a widow's pose perfected. That very photograph became a turning point. It showed what the world wanted to see: a wife mourning, a family in sorrow. It hid what I had found: the receipts, the videos, and the posts that proved she had been far from mourning when it counted. I took the photograph to my lawyer. I showed him the post. I showed him the date and the time. I showed him her smile in the light, and then the same woman in the images from the nights my son lay in a hospital bed. The wine glass and laughter. The contrast was clear. A piece of paper with a face could not cover over the facts that his camera had recorded. The lawyer looked at the photograph and did not say much. He simply collected the files and put them together in a folder that had the weight of law. He told me to let him handle the next steps. He told me I had done the right thing by keeping everything. When the police began their questions, the photograph helped. It was easy to show that the woman who celebrated in a night of freedom and posted it publicly had also stood smiling for the camera while the man who loved her was gone. The photograph on the funeral program made the contrast sharper, not kinder. It put her performance on public display in a way no private memory could. People who had never trusted their feelings could now see the difference between what she showed and what she did. The photograph did what my words alone could not. It offered a clear image that even those who did not know my son well could understand. I did not use the photograph as a weapon to humiliate. I used it to show truth. The camera had captured her false face in a way that matched the evidence I already had. It anchored the files and the recordings to a time and place when the world expected sorrow, but instead found performative joy. Each time the image circulated, more questions were asked and more details came forward. Friends of hers who had spoken kindly in public began to remember nights and expenses they had found odd. Banks returned calls they had not returned before. The photograph opened doors that had been closed by polite smiles and rehearsed grief. There were people who tried to defend her, who said a single image could not prove intent or neglect. I listened and respected the need for proof. That was why I had the videos and the letters. The photograph was a part of the story. One clear, undeniable part. It joined the rest of the evidence in a ring that could not be broken by a rehearsed apology or a staged sadness. When the legal process began, it relied on more than the photo. It used the recordings, the receipts, and the testimony of those who had seen inconsistencies. The photo only made the public understand why we were asking for answers. At night, when the house was quiet and my granddaughter slept with her small hand over her face, I would take out the photograph once more. I looked not with hatred, but with a steady heart. I honored my son by making sure his truth was told. The photo had become a map. It pointed to the small moments that together formed a pattern of betrayal. That pattern was now visible to people who mattered. The camera had caught the woman who smiled while my son lay dying. The same camera had given me the proof I needed. I kept the photograph folded in my folder of evidence, next to the video files and the letters. It became part of the story I would tell the world. A careful, slow telling that would not be undone by a clever smile. After witnessing her actions in the videos, I knew that waiting or confronting her privately wouldn't suffice. The betrayal was too deep, the deception too extensive. I gathered every piece of evidence my son had left behind. The letters he never sent, the receipts she had carelessly left around, the detailed accounts of her late-night outings, and the half-used memory card from his camera that recorded her every move. I made copies of everything, organizing them meticulously, making sure there was a clear, undeniable trail. Every detail mattered. Every slip of her hand, every misplaced receipt, every whispered conversation captured on tape could serve as proof. I wanted no doubt, no possibility of her evading responsibility. I called my lawyer the following morning. I chose the earliest hour while the city was still quiet, streets barely alive with the first stirrings of the day. I explained everything calmly, without hysteria, because anger wouldn't help me. Precision and preparation would. I told him about the tapes, the letters, the receipts, and my son's warnings. I described her smiles, the parties, the casual way she had enjoyed herself while my son suffered in silence. Each word I spoke was deliberate, measured, painting a full picture of her calculated betrayal. My lawyer listened in silence, occasionally nodding, making notes. He understood immediately the gravity of the situation and how carefully we needed to proceed. We planned the next steps together, mapping out every possible legal route. We couldn't act recklessly. This was not just about anger or revenge. It was about justice, exposing her actions to the authorities, and ensuring she could not escape the consequences of her choices. I instructed him to prepare letters, summons, and notifications to the police, detailing every transaction, every late-night call, every sign of fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet it had to be presented in a way that could not be dismissed. I remembered my son's instructions from the tape. Don't let her erase my life. Expose her. I intended to follow them to the letter. After hanging up, I felt a strange sense of control. For years, I had watched helplessly, powerless to intervene in the life my son had tried to protect. I had been forced to bear witness to her lies and her exploitation silently, never able to speak or act because he had wanted to shield me, protect me from conflict. But now, armed with the truth, I finally had the means to act decisively. I felt a mixture of sorrow and resolve, grief and clarity. My son's suffering could not be undone, but his foresight had provided the tools to hold her accountable, and I would not squander them. In the following days, I sent copies of the letters, receipts, and recordings to my lawyer. I kept meticulous notes, creating a clear timeline of her deceit. Every fraudulent action, every misused account, every moment she had chosen indulgence over care for my son was documented. I felt no satisfaction in her exposure, only the determination to ensure that the world saw the truth. I wanted her to face the consequences, not as revenge, but as justice for the life she had violated and the trust she had destroyed. Each step I took was guided by the meticulous record my son had left behind. The moment she was contacted by the authorities, I watched silently. I did not gloat, did not call to taunt or accuse. I allowed the law and the evidence to speak for themselves. The realization that her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble was palpable. Her reactions were subtle at first, hesitant glances, sudden silences, careful words, but the foundation of lies she had built over years could not withstand the weight of truth. My son's meticulous documentation, combined with my careful action, ensured that her smile, once so confidently displayed in photos and posts, could no longer hide the reality of her deeds. The police questioned her methodically, presenting the evidence, each letter, each video, each receipt. I observed the proceedings quietly, heart pounding but composed, knowing this was what my son had wanted, what he had prepared me for. She could not deny the recordings, could not explain away the careful notes and receipts. Every attempt to deflect or minimize was met with counter-evidence, each one more damning than the last. By the end of the week, it was clear she would face legal consequences for her actions. Her carefully curated world had begun to unravel. I felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, sorrow, and a sense of completion. Relief that her deceit could no longer continue, sorrow for the life my son had endured and the years lost to manipulation, and completion in knowing that justice, slow and deliberate, had been set in motion. She could no longer parade her false image of innocence or happiness, could no longer escape the accountability she had long avoided. Finally, I realized that my son's foresight, his courage to document the truth despite his suffering, had not been in vain. I had acted with care, precision, and respect for his memory, ensuring that the world knew what he had endured and what she had done. It was not a moment of triumph or celebration. It was a moment of rightful acknowledgement, of bringing hidden truths into the light. I felt my son's presence with me in that moment, as if he were whispering, "Thank you, Mom. You did what I could not." From that day on, she could not maintain her false image. Her smiles became forced, her public persona fractured. The consequences of her choices were visible, and every action she had taken in secrecy was now exposed for everyone to see. I understood then that justice could be quiet, methodical, and unwavering. It was not about rage or retaliation. It was about ensuring truth prevailed and that the life of my son, the suffering he endured, and the careful documentation he left behind were honored fully. After the police investigation began, I noticed the subtle shifts in her life almost immediately. She stopped answering calls from friends, she avoided neighbors, and her social media accounts disappeared one by one. Where once her posts had been filled with smiles, fancy dinners, and vacations, there was now silence. I heard from people in the neighborhood and distant relatives that she had begun to avoid mirrors entirely, refusing to face her own reflection. Every day, I imagined her passing by a mirror, pausing, trying to avoid the image staring back at her, the same face that had once smiled so effortlessly while my son suffered. I knew she could no longer pretend, could no longer hide behind the carefully curated facade that had carried her through life. The first time I heard she had smashed a framed photograph in her home, I didn't feel joy. I felt confirmation. Every frame, every image, every reminder of herself had become unbearable. She could no longer bear to see the woman who had treated my son with indifference, who had chosen her own pleasure over his life, who had laughed and celebrated while he lay in pain. The mirrors were cruel in their honesty, reflecting a face she no longer recognized, showing a woman who had committed betrayal and cruelty in plain view. I imagined her walking through her empty rooms, past broken glass and scattered photos, the sound of shards underfoot echoing the cracks in her conscience. She tried to cover it, of course. I heard she painted over walls, rearranged furniture, bought new frames, replaced mirrors, all in a futile attempt to erase the past. But no matter what she did, the truth had a weight that could not be hidden. Every time she passed a reflective surface, every time she caught sight of herself in a shop window or a polished car, she must have felt it. The undeniable truth of what she had done and how she had hurt someone who trusted her with their life. Her face, once confident and smiling, now betrayed worry, guilt, and fear. I knew that even without my presence, justice had found its way into her daily life, manifesting in her inability to face herself. I remembered the videos and letters I had handed to my lawyer. Each one had been carefully preserved, each detail documented. Every receipt of her indulgences, every late-night call, every careless moment she had recorded for herself became a mirror I could hold up for her indirectly. The authorities had presented it all methodically, showing her actions in black and white, leaving no room for denial. When the police and legal teams began questioning her about missing funds, falsified accounts, and her actions while my son was dying, she must have realized the true magnitude of her exposure. The truth was no longer a secret, and every mirror in her home reflected that undeniable reality. Neighbors began to whisper, and distant friends started noticing her absence. She no longer attended social gatherings. She no longer posted photographs. She no longer smiled in public. Her reputation, once carefully maintained through charm and performance, was cracking under the weight of reality. I knew that every time she looked at herself now, she couldn't escape the judgment, not from others, but from herself. The woman in the mirror, staring back with forced expressions and shaky hands, was a constant reminder that actions have consequences. She could no longer pretend innocence. She could no longer wear the mask of celebration while hiding guilt beneath. I imagined her alone at home, staring into a mirror, the reflection showing the woman who had been exposed. No camera, no lawyer, no friend could change what she now saw for herself. The confident, smiling persona had been replaced by a woman broken by truth. She could no longer escape the reality of her choices, the reality that my son had suffered and that she had been caught. I understood then that justice has many forms. It isn't always loud or public. Sometimes it is the quiet, inescapable truth reflected in a face you cannot avoid. Her reaction was subtle but powerful. I heard she had smashed mirrors, replaced frames, rearranged furniture, all as futile attempts to distance herself from her actions. Every surface that once reflected her smiling, carefree face became unbearable. She could not look without confronting the reality of the woman she had become. I felt no pleasure in her discomfort. I felt the satisfaction of balance being restored, of truth finding its place, of my son's memory being honored. She could not erase herself, could not run from herself, could not hide from the mirror that now held her accountable every single day. Even weeks later, when the legal process continued, she avoided windows, avoided public appearances, avoided cameras, avoided friends. I heard reports that she refused to attend social gatherings, that she had retreated into her home, that she looked nervous and wary whenever anyone approached. Each step, each reflection, each broken frame reinforced the consequences of her choices. She had tried to live in comfort and illusion, but the mirrors revealed the truth she had long ignored. I knew that the same woman who had once smiled so freely while my son's heart stopped now trembled every time she caught her own reflection. And I realized then that this was perhaps the most powerful form of accountability. No judge, no lawyer, no media coverage could force the internal reckoning she was now facing every day. The mirrors did what the law could not. They confronted her with herself, her actions, and the pain she had caused. Every glance, every shadow, every reflection became a reminder of the betrayal she had committed. She could no longer smile for the camera because the reflection she faced in silence told a story she could not hide. I watched all of this unfold quietly from a distance, never gloating, never celebrating. I simply observed the consequences of truth in motion. My son's life, his struggles, and his careful documentation had ensured that justice, both legal and personal, was served. She could no longer hide behind smiles or fake apologies. Every mirror in her life had become a witness, and she could not look away. Her inability to face herself was perhaps the most fitting consequence for someone who had smiled freely while my son suffered, a daily reminder that truth always finds its way to the surface. Months passed after the police investigation, and the story began to make its way into public awareness. A local newspaper picked up the case, running a detailed article about the widow facing fraud charges, the missing insurance funds, and the manipulation she had carried out while my son lay dying. They included one photograph that immediately drew attention, the very image of her smiling beside my son's casket, wine glass in hand, posing as if she were part of some celebration rather than mourning. The paper highlighted the stark contrast between her public display of emotion and the evidence of her deceit, showing a woman who had attempted to manipulate perception while betraying trust. When I saw it in print, I didn't feel triumph or vengeance. I felt that cold, precise satisfaction that comes from knowing truth has finally surfaced. It was more than just a photograph. It was a symbol of everything she had tried to hide. The letters my son had written, detailing her coldness, her financial exploitation, and her neglect, were now backed by undeniable evidence of her smiling inappropriately at the wrong time. People began to recognize the discrepancy, friends, distant relatives, even casual readers of the article, and the impact was immediate. Social media users circulated the image, pointing out the dissonance between her behavior and the grief that should have accompanied her husband's death. She was no longer able to control the narrative. Her carefully curated image, built over years of public appearances and deceptive charm, was collapsing in real time. I watched as the repercussions unfolded. Calls from acquaintances and distant family members began to question her actions, her intentions, and her moral character. Invitations to events disappeared, friendships dissolved quietly, and wherever she went, whispers followed. She couldn't defend herself, not fully, not convincingly. The evidence, the photograph, the letters, the videos, all of it painted a picture of someone who had prioritized herself over my son's well-being. And for the first time, the world outside our home was seeing the truth exactly as it had been all along. The lie she had lived in, the mask she had worn, was stripped away by reality, leaving only the reflection of her own actions staring back at her. The photograph became a focal point. Each time she saw it, whether online, in print, or when reminded of it by someone else, it forced a confrontation she could not escape. She had smiled freely while my son's heart stopped, but now that same image branded her permanently in the eyes of everyone who saw it. It was a constant, undeniable reminder of the betrayal she had committed. No excuses, no false narratives, no denial could erase it. And for someone who had thrived on maintaining appearances, the exposure was devastating. Her public reputation crumbled, while the truth remained firmly intact, visible, and undeniable. Legal consequences followed alongside the social repercussions. The police and financial authorities pursued the case, presenting evidence from my lawyer, every receipt, every video, every letter carefully documented. The authorities questioned her repeatedly, leaving her in a position of constant scrutiny. She could no longer hide behind charm or excuses. Her deceit, carefully hidden for so long, was exposed in full. Even her attempts to explain or soften the facts could not overcome the overwhelming weight of evidence. She had tried to manipulate appearances, but now appearances were powerless against documented truth. I stayed mostly out of the public eye during this time. I did not need to broadcast her exposure or announce my satisfaction. The truth had done its work without my intervention. I could see, from a distance, how she shrank into herself, avoided mirrors, refused social events, and no longer smiled for cameras. The same woman who had laughed while my son suffered was now unable to face a reflection without shame and regret. I understood then that the consequences of one's actions do not always require confrontation or vengeance. Sometimes the universe and the truth itself provide the reckoning. Her avoidance of mirrors and public appearances became widely noted among her acquaintances. Rumors circulated that she had begun to destroy photographs, replace mirrors, and remove images from her home, all to avoid confronting the person she had become. The evidence, combined with public scrutiny, had created a psychological burden she could not escape. Each reflection, each reminder, reinforced her guilt and fear. She had once celebrated while my son's heart stopped, and now she could not even stand to see the woman who had done it. It was poetic in its quiet, unavoidable justice. As the weeks turned into months, the legal system continued its work. She faced charges related to the misappropriation of funds and manipulation of my son's estate. I attended court sessions as quietly as possible, observing the process unfold. Every hearing, every piece of evidence presented, every cross-examination reinforced the truth. She could not claim innocence, she could not fabricate remorse, and she could not erase her public exposure. The photograph of her smiling, once a tool of manipulation, became the symbol of her downfall. It was the undeniable record of her actions during a moment when compassion and loyalty were demanded, and she had failed completely. Through all of this, I maintained a quiet dignity. I did not gloat or make public statements. I let the evidence, the photograph, the legal process, and the whispers of those who witnessed her exposure carry the story. I understood the power of truth and timing, that justice need not be loud or aggressive. It merely needs to exist and be recognized. And the world had recognized her for what she had done. My son's memory had been honored, his life vindicated, and her deception laid bare. By the time the article was published and legal proceedings concluded, she had become a shadow of the woman she once was. Her public persona was shattered, her reputation destroyed, and her ability to face herself removed entirely. The photograph, once a carefree image of joy and false freedom, now served as a permanent reminder of guilt and accountability. She could not escape it, nor could she rebuild the persona she had lost. I finally understood that exposure, combined with time and truth, is one of the most effective forms of justice. The truth finally shown was not about vengeance or malice on my part. It was about recognition. The recognition of my son's suffering, the recognition of her betrayal, and the recognition that the world had seen the full picture. No smiles could hide the reality anymore. No charm, no excuses, no evasions could reverse what had been documented, displayed, and understood. She could no longer celebrate, and she could no longer avoid her own reflection, and that, more than anything, brought a quiet satisfaction, knowing that justice had been served in the most enduring and undeniable way. Every Sunday, I make the short drive to the cemetery, the wind carrying a chill that reminds me of the winters I once endured while raising my son alone. The gravel crunches under my shoes as I walk along familiar paths lined with oak trees, their branches heavy with age and wisdom. I carry with me a small bouquet of daisies, his favorite flowers, and the old camera he used to film snippets of his life, little pieces of memory that now feel heavier than gold. I never press record anymore. The memories themselves are enough, unspoken but deeply felt, stored in the quiet corners of my heart. Some moments do not need to be captured in video to live forever. They exist in the mind, in the breath, in the steady beat of a grieving mother's heart that has survived betrayal, loss, and injustice. As I approach his grave, I pause, taking a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, and I think of all the moments I never got to share with him. The laughter, the late-night stories, the small achievements I celebrated silently. All of it flashes before me in fragments, as vivid and piercing as the day they occurred. I kneel slowly, placing the daisies carefully on the grass, brushing away leaves and dust from the headstone. His name carved into the stone feels like a final affirmation that he existed fully, that his life mattered, and that my devotion as a mother was never in vain. The stone is cold under my hands, but the warmth of memories and love surrounds me, unbroken by time or grief. I watch as my granddaughter, his daughter, plays nearby. Her laughter rings clear across the cemetery, light and unburdened, a stark contrast to the heavy silence of the adults around her. She does not yet know the full extent of her mother's betrayal, and I choose to keep it that way. Some truths are too heavy for young hearts, too painful for innocence to bear, but I know that she feels love, safety, and belonging. All the things her mother failed to provide. I smile quietly as I watch her run among the gravestones, her small feet kicking up gravel, the sun glinting off her hair, her giggles echoing like a promise that life continues, that joy persists even in the shadow of sorrow. She is the living proof that my son's legacy, his courage, his kindness, his love, endures, and that even in the face of betrayal, goodness can prevail. I sit down slowly on the bench beside the grave, the old camera resting beside me. Its weight is comforting, a connection to the past and a reminder of the moments I had preserved, the warnings, the glimpses of truth, the evidence that ensured justice. I close my eyes and whisper to him softly, "Mission complete, son. You can rest now." No one hears me but the wind, the trees, and perhaps, in some way, him. I feel the lingering presence of his spirit, a silent approval of the steps I took to protect his daughter, to expose the deceit that would have overshadowed his final days, to ensure that the woman who betrayed him could no longer manipulate, lie, or hide behind smiles. The justice is quiet, the exposure complete, and the peace, finally, tangible. I reflect on the months that followed his passing, the legal battles, the court sessions, the scrutiny, and the social consequences that befell his widow. I do not take pride in the suffering of others, but I recognize the inevitability of truth. It surfaces eventually, and when it does, it reshapes everything. She can no longer smile freely. She cannot face her reflection. She cannot escape the record of her actions. The photograph, the videos, the letters, all stand as testament to her deception. Watching this unfold has taught me that justice does not need to roar. It can arrive quietly, patiently, and with the weight of undeniable facts. And in that quiet, I find solace. I spend these Sundays in contemplation, allowing my grief to be accompanied by reflection and calm. I recall his childhood, the sacrifices, the long nights, and the moments when my love kept him safe and nurtured. I remember the betrayal, the heartbreak of seeing someone so close exploit him, and the resolve it instilled in me to act with precision and clarity. Each memory is a thread woven into the fabric of my life, painful yet strengthening, shaping the woman I have become, resilient, observant, decisive. The camera, though no longer recording, remains a symbol of vigilance, of the power to document truth, and the courage to use it when the moment demands. Sometimes I catch myself smiling softly as I watch my granddaughter, remembering that the next generation carries hope and innocence. I tell myself that while my son could not be spared, his spirit lives on in her laughter, her curiosity, and her untainted joy. I think of all the mothers who have silently endured betrayal, grief, or deceit, and I feel a kinship with them. Our strength lies not just in surviving, but in ensuring that the legacy of our children is protected, that the truths we uncover are not lost, and that justice, though quiet, is served. As the sun begins to dip, casting long shadows over the cemetery, I rise slowly. I gather my granddaughter's hand, and we walk home together, the weight of the past tempered by the hope of the present. The camera is tucked safely in my bag, a reminder of vigilance, of actions taken, and of truths revealed. I feel lighter, unburdened, knowing that my son's story has been honored, his daughter protected, and the woman who caused harm cannot undo the steps I took to restore balance. Each Sunday, this ritual reinforces the peace I have claimed, the closure I have ensured, and the quiet dignity I now inhabit. Some days, I pause by the gravestone and linger, letting the wind brush my face, listening to the laughter around me. I know that life continues, and I am here to witness it fully, awake, aware, and present. My mission, though born of heartbreak, was completed with care and precision. In the silence, in the laughter of the young, in the memory of my son, and in the unwavering truth that has come to light, I find a quiet, enduring satisfaction. Some memories deserve silence, and some victories are best kept private, felt deeply rather than announced. I never press record anymore. The camera rests beside me, a silent observer of a journey that demanded courage, clarity, and action. I walk away from the cemetery each Sunday with the weight of past sorrow replaced by the calm of fulfillment. The peace is mine, earned not through confrontation or anger, but through vigilance, evidence, and the patient unfolding of truth. And as I whisper, just as I did when I first knelt by my son's grave, "You were right, son." She can't fake her smile anymore. I feel the completeness of justice, the quiet of closure, and the enduring presence of love that even betrayal cannot diminish.